So we're now into the second part of our discussion of chapter 7, which is race and ethnicity. In the first part, in our call last week, we established that sociologists understand race as a social category based on real or perceived biological differences between groups of people. Sociologists argue that race is more meaningful on a cultural, political, economic, social level than it is on a biological level. I've been teaching intro to sociology for almost a decade now. I taught intro to sociology for the first time when I was getting my master's degree in 2011. And the way I used to start the conversation about race and racism was like this. Around 2008, which that year is significant, there started to be a growing amount of people who argued that America as a society had arrived to a post-racial period, that racism was a thing of the past. Now, 2008 is significant because that's the year Barack Obama was elected as president. And so right around 2008, well, a little bit before 2008, but really the election of Barack Obama really emboldened this argument that if we have a Black man or a biracial man or a non-white man in the highest office of the land, then this is tangible proof, evidence, it's objective evidence that America is no longer a racist society. And so when I would talk about racism in intro to sociology classes for the first 5 years or 5 or 6 years I taught, I would start by problematizing that idea that we had arrived in a post-racial society. Now, unless you've been living under a rock for the last 4 or 5 years, I'm going to venture to guess that most of you on this call don't buy into the notion that race doesn't matter, or that our society is post-racial. Like racism is something we don't deal with anymore in 21st century America. And I think that what has happened is in the last 4 or 5 years, especially in the last year, the last 6 months, a lot of racial tensions have sort of flared up. And so we see on the news, we see on social media, a lot of evidence of racial conflict, of contention related to race relations that don't seem harmonious, but seem disruptive and conflict ridden. Now, sociologists have studied race and racism for about 100 years during times of peace and during times of conflict. And so it may not be helpful to start this conversation by talking about whether we're racial or post-racial, or a racist society or a society that's beyond racism, because I think that everything around us right now seems like race still matters. But the reason sociologists have always have been studying this for so long, the reason we study race as a social category, the reason we talk about the history of race, is because racism, this concept on the slide, is still a very real thing. Now, racism is a concept that most of us are familiar with. It's a concept that we hear, or that maybe we even use to label different things or people. But I want to provide you with a sociological definition of racism. This definition is not better than the way you might define racism. But remember, when it comes to the sciences, if you want to study something, if you want to measure something, you have to articulate and define exactly what it is you're looking for. In other words, the official way to say that is you have to operationalize your variables. And so if you want to study the concept of racism, then you have to be able to articulate what exactly do we think we're looking for when we say we're going to measure racism. And so this definition gives us some of the language to identify in research studies and in public policy, in society at large, where racism exists or where it doesn't exist. So this definition defines racism as a combination of racial prejudice, and racial discrimination. Prejudice and discrimination are also two concepts that most of us are familiar with. Sometimes we interchange racism and prejudice and discrimination. These are terms we kind of flip-flop. But the terms prejudice and discrimination are related, but they're related terms, and they do have some overlap, but they're not inherently linked to each other. A good way to distinguish between something that's racially prejudiced and something, or prejudicial, and something that's discriminatory by race is prejudice is an internal evaluation. Discrimination is an action. It's something external to us. So prejudice is negative thoughts and feelings about an ethnic or a racial group, if we're talking about a racial prejudice. Racial discrimination is an act that treats people unequally or unfairly because of their group membership in a specific race or another race. Prejudice is how you perceive people. Discrimination is how you act towards people. What's interesting, again, these terms, being prejudiced and being discriminatory, are related, but they don't always have to go together. There's sometimes when people discriminate when they themselves don't hold any prejudice. And I think peer pressure is a really good example of why people might treat another individual unfairly, even if they themselves don't have any negative feelings towards this group of people. So if you, let's say, this is a hypothetical example, but let's say there is a small firm, it's a tech company, and everyone in the tech company is, the tech company, the owner, the head manager, and all the staff are Black women. And let's say that the hiring manager brings in some candidates, and one of the candidates is a Black woman, but the other candidate is a white man. And that manager herself doesn't hold any racial prejudice or hostility towards people who are not Black women. But let's say that in that hiring decision, she takes these two candidates back to her team and asks them to weigh in on who they would like her to hire. And let's say that the majority of the women who work in this firm, they don't want a white male to join the team because they think it, for whatever reason, it will ruin camaraderie or morale or something else. So that hiring manager then chooses to hire the Black woman instead of a white man. In that case, the hiring manager has discriminated against the white man, even though she herself didn't hold any negative prejudices. That's a hypothetical example, but there's times when people treat other people bad, even if at the individual level, they don't feel any negative stereotypes or judgment, prejudices towards these people, but they know their neighbors, they know their friends, right, do. And so we act on peer pressure instead of our true prejudices. And then there's some examples of times where people can be deeply prejudicial and never discriminate against someone else. There's people who hold the most nasty stereotypes in their mind and in their hearts. And when they see people, they immediately judge them, but maybe they never discriminate. Now there's something interesting. There's an interesting piece of this definition that's not listed on the slide. If discrimination is an action it's something external, it's something you do to someone else unfairly, it's an unfair treatment towards another individual. A part of that definition that's not listed on the slide is that in order to discriminate against someone, you have to have power. And we talked about power in this class earlier this semester. In sociology parlance, power is defined as the ability to enact your own will, even in the face of resistance. So someone who discriminates against someone is doing so even in the face of potential resistance. And that requires a form of power in society. Oftentimes, when people talk about racism, we talk about it as if it's some sort of rigid dichotomy. You're either prejudiced or you're not prejudiced. It's something is either discriminatory or it's not. It's either racist or it's not racist. It's either evil or it's good. And I would offer that this is far too simplistic and maybe even unrealistic. Being prejudiced and discriminating is not an either or kind of thing. Racism is not something we can boil down into a label of racist or not racist, despite the sort of impulse to do so. The matrix on the slide here, I think, moves us closer to capturing the nuance of how racism works in our society. And even this might be a little bit too simple, right? Race, the social category, race relations, how people interact with each other based on that social category, racism, discrimination and prejudice based on race. These are complicated phenomena, right? And so even this matrix here doesn't maybe quite do it justice, but it gets us closer to capturing, like, to not only capturing the nuance of race in our society, but articulating what we mean when we say something is racist. So sociologists and social scientists broadly, and even historians, all pretty much agree that race relations in US history was terrible, violent, just extreme forms of prejudice and discrimination towards non-white people was terrible in US history. And even though in the last 6 months, the last year, we've seen racial tensions kind of flare up in our society, I think most of you would agree that the people living 100 years ago, there was more tension, more conflict related to race than we were experiencing today. This graphic captures some of that historical arc, moving from forms of racism that were in your face, overt, intentional, blatant, to forms of racism that are hard to pinpoint, are hard to identify, are more subtle. And I'll walk, and it also captures, this graphic, not only this sort of historical transition, but it also helps us identify things that are prejudicial and discriminatory, forms of racism that exist at the individual level or the interactional level, versus things that happen at the institutional level and what is called institutional racism. So I'll walk you through just quickly some examples of each of these squares here. So in this first quadrant, we have an example of racism, racial prejudice, racial discrimination that is overt, blatant, in your face, and it's happening at the interactional level, meaning between two individuals or between two small groups of people. The image on the slide here is an image of a burning cross and somebody in a KKK, Ku Klux Klan uniform, which is a white supremacist group in the United States. Now, the KKK emerged to terrorize African Americans after the end of slavery, so after the Civil War. And from the end of the 1800s, really sort of through the early 1900s and a little bit today, the things that this group does exemplify individual racism, or racism that is over, in your face, and it's at the interactional level. The reflection assignment I had you do last week sort of speaks to this a little bit. You listened to the song "Strange Fruit" by Billie Holiday, which talked about lynchings that occurred in the American South. That was a form of racial terrorism. That was a form of racism that happened at the individual level. And it was overt, it was obvious. Lynchings were, in some places, almost like picnics. They were public events. And so it's not to say that lynching doesn't occur anymore, but it's not overt. It is not acceptable. It is something that has moved to the fringes of society. Jumping down to the, well, actually, let's jump over to the right. So the next quadrant here talks about forms of racism that are at the individual or interactional level, but that are more subtle. So we don't have lynch mobs who are snatching Black men out of their home and lynching them in the town square anymore. So what forms of racism do we see that happen at the individual or the interactional level? I would say that one of the most popular concepts that comes out of the social science on race and race relations is this concept of implicit bias or unconscious bias. Many of you have heard about this before. There's been a ton of research studies and experiments done on implicit bias, but basically it's this idea that all of us have these, based on the society that we're in, based on the different ways we're socialized, we're all inundated with messages that are stereotypical about different groups of people. And so in our interactions with another person who's different than us, right, without us even knowing, subconsciously, implicitly, we might act on those prejudices towards someone else. So we might call the police because we see someone as a criminal instead of just hanging out, right? A police officer might resort to lethal force instead of a taser, right? If they see someone, if their perception of someone is colored in a certain way. I think most people have heard about the KKK and like the lynch mobs and this sort of extreme form of racism. I think most of you have probably even heard of implicit bias before. I think it's easy for Americans to understand racism as something that people think and is something that mean people do to someone else. Racism at the interactional level, at the individual level, it's important, but it's not the only piece of the picture. There are other forms of prejudice and discrimination that exist at the structural or institutional level of society. And this is not always obvious to people. So if we jump to this quadrant, this third quadrant, these are examples of forms of racism that are overt, intentional, and exist at the institutional level. So many of you may be familiar with this history, but again, in the period after the Civil War, a series of legislation and law was passed that established separate facilities for white and non-white people. So this pictured on the slide here is a Black woman in the South drinking out of a water fountain that said colored only. There were separate water fountains, there were separate pools, there were separate schools, there were separate buses, there were separate hotels. Separate but equal was considered the law of the land in the American South. Segregation was the law of the land in American South. Even in the North, there was no, and that system was called Jim Crow, by the way. Even in the North, there was no Jim Crow segregation, but there was still segregation. My grandfather, who was a World War II veteran, he used to tell us stories of how he came home from the war at the end of the 40s to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which is in the North, and the bartender at the local pub refused to serve him a beer. So that's an example of forms of discrimination that are overt, they're obvious, they're even embedded into our laws, and they exist, therefore, at the institutional level. It's not a mean person terrorizing someone else. This is a system that is saying people, some people should be funneled towards resources and opportunity, and some people should be excluded from those resources and opportunities. Historically, we have a ton of examples of this in American society. Overt, intentional forms of racism in our legal system, in housing, in education, etc. What's interesting is social scientists have also uncovered the unfortunate reality that even though those overt, blatant forms of segregation went away during the civil rights era, during the 50s and 60s, a lot of that stuff was outlawed. We still see forms of intense segregation today. And so in this final quadrant here is a picture, it's a picture, a bird's eye view of the city of Cleveland. The map is blank at the top here because that's Lake Erie. And the data that is plotted on this map is the race of people who live in Cleveland. The color blue is African Americans. The color white is the color red, I'm sorry, is for white Americans. And so in Cleveland, if you plot where people live based on race, you get this really interesting pattern. Again, this is like being in a plane. This is a bird's eye perspective. Where are people living based on their race? And so in every city, not just in some city, in every major city across America, where people live clusters or is segregated by race. Now, it may not be obvious why people living in different parts of town is a form of racism, but there are some direct connections between the overt forms of racism that were outlawed in the 50s and 60s and sort of the ongoing structures of segregation that we see today. And we'll talk more about housing segregation as an example of institutional racism more in our final lesson next week. So institutional racism is a type of racism that I don't think most people are familiar with until they take a sociology class. I think that I'm hearing politicians and newscasters talk about structural or institutional or systemic racism. But basically, this is the idea that racism is happening due to the everyday operations of our society. It's the notion that race lies underneath, around, and across our society. It's everywhere. It's embedded into our institutions, into our social fabric. It's the notion that race is a system of social stratification. We talked about stratification a few weeks ago. Stratification means patterned, structured, repeatable, identifiable, hierarchical inequality between people. I was looking in our textbook just to give you some content, something to compare it to. Our book defines institutional racism like this. It's the idea that our nation's core institutions, like the legal, educational, criminal justice systems, are embedded with racial biases and preferences that recreate and maintain racial inequality. So the inequalities, the disparities that we see in society in terms of race are structured into our society and reinforced by the institutions in society. Now, some people argue, what's interesting about institutional racism is I've heard people argue that to say that a society has institutional racism is an argument that basically is saying racism can persist. Prejudice and discrimination by race could happen even without there being any bigots, even without there being any racist person pulling the lever. As we've seen historically, forms of bigotry and overt, in-your-face racism decline, the institutional forms of racism still persist. They still carry on. So who's pulling the lever if it's not, if we are not a society full of bigots, which I don't think there's evidence to suggest that we are, who's pulling the lever? Like, why do we still have institutional forms of racism when we outlawed them legally, right? They're not constitutional anymore. Also, culturally, Americans don't think it's appropriate anymore. What's going on? And I'll end this conversation with a recap of something we talked about earlier this semester when we first talked about the concept of a social structure. And I mentioned at the end of that lesson that social structures, they both guide and they constrain our life, and that they endure beyond the lifetime of any one individual. And we talked about 3 different reasons or explanations for why social structures persist. And I think that these are helpful for understanding why racism at the institutional level can still persist, even if you have a society that at face value is saying, we don't value racism, we don't support racism, yet we still have it. How could that occur? So the three points on the slide sort of help us explain why structure persists and endures over time. It generates its own interest groups, structures garner broad public support, and then this third concept of pathway dependency. I'll talk about these in reverse order as it relates to race. So pathway dependency is the idea that we create something. We invent something, we create an organization, a constitution, right? We write the Declaration of Independence, and that sets us on a course of action. Once we start down that pathway, other courses of action, we almost have blinders up to other possible options for what we might do. Sort of pathway dependency is we do what we've always done because that's what we've always done, you know? So racism, I think, is an example of pathway dependency, institutional racism, and specifically if we look at the institution of housing. Historically, race dictated who could purchase land or not purchase land. When it came to buying a house, to getting a mortgage, your race determined whether or not banks would lend to you or not. And then whether or not a landlord would be willing to rent to you. So even if you weren't willing to buy the land or the house and you just needed a place to live, race still mattered in terms of where you could live. So even though we don't like it, pathway dependency as an explanation would say that we're still on this same course of discriminating by race in the arena of housing. So where people live is a little bit about economics. It's a little bit about our preferences for suburbs versus cities versus small towns, but also that history of race is still embedded in the logic of the way we do housing in America. The second point that structures garner broad public support. If the way our institutions work is seen as more beneficial than harmful, then most people will support standing institutions. Most people don't want to dismantle an entire institution that's seen to be more good than it is bad. When it was discovered, and discovered might not be the best way to say that, when enough Americans decided that the political institution was racist, the civil rights era, the different movements involved in the civil rights era, the different legislation that came out of it, did not dismantle the American political system or the structure of that institution. They did fight to include previously marginalized groups into an already established system. So we solved the problem of racial exclusion by including people of color into politics. A byproduct is that we now have many Americans across all different racial groups who will vote and participate in the political system without challenging the history or the logic of that institution. And again, if the political system was structured in a way where race was at its origins was a factor in who could vote and who couldn't, which it was, then the irony is that there's people historically who were excluded from the system who are now some of its biggest proponents. And then this third point, structures generate their own interest groups. There are some people who like racism, who value racism. There's some people who see white supremacy as a logical and natural order of things. And I think people who take this perspective nowadays represent a small group of Americans, but they are members of our society who feel this way. So taken together, these are three things or factors or actors that are pulling the levers of what's called structural or systemic or institutional racism. And my goal with every lesson is to provide you some context and some perspective on things. The topic of race, the topic of racism, the topic of race relations is complicated. It's something that scholars have been studying for 100 years now. It's something that, again, Americans sometimes want to engage with discussions about race during times of conflict, but during times of peace and in civility and stability, Americans want to, we don't like to talk about race and our history with race. And like I told you at the beginning of the semester, sociology doesn't always offer a fix to things, but I do think it helps us I do think it's a useful diagnostic tool. It helps us figure out what's going on and what's going wrong, and sort of the dynamics related to these different, really complicated phenomena that we see.